It started out as nothing, really. Just another Saturday afternoon with the house full of voices and laughter. My son had invited a few friends over, and the kitchen was buzzing with noise and energy. I'd always loved having them around, seeing my son happy and watching them joke around like they had no cares in the world. And then there was Ryan, my son's best friend. He'd always been polite, always made a point to thank me for every meal, every invitation. I'd known him since he was a kid, and he felt almost like family. Almost. But something had changed. Maybe it was just my imagination, but over the past few months I'd noticed him watching me differently, his gaze lingering a little longer than it used to. I brushed it off, telling myself he was just being friendly, but there was a warmth in his smile that made me feel, well, younger somehow. It was silly, of course. He was so much younger than me, and besides, I was happily married, but it was hard not to notice. That afternoon, as I stood at the kitchen counter preparing snacks for the boys, Ryan walked in. The others were still in the living room, caught up in their own conversations, so it was just the two of us. He leaned against the counter, watching me with that familiar smile, and I couldn't help but smile back. "Thanks for letting us hang out here, Mrs. Carson," he said, his voice low and warm. "It's always nice here. Feels like home." There was something in his tone that made me pause. I glanced at him, trying to gauge if he meant anything by it, but his face was open and relaxed, almost innocent. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something else beneath his words. "Oh, it's no trouble," I replied, brushing a stray lock of hair behind my ear. "I'm just glad you all feel comfortable here." Our eyes met, and for a moment, the room felt strangely quiet, even though I could still hear the muffled laughter of the others in the background. I tried to ignore the sudden flutter in my stomach, but it was there, and I hated that I couldn't control it. This was ridiculous. He was just a kid, my son's best friend. I shouldn't be feeling this way. But Ryan didn't look away. His gaze was steady, almost curious, like he was seeing me for the first time. My heart raced, and I felt an odd thrill, a mix of excitement and guilt. I knew I should look away, laugh it off, say something to break the tension, but I was frozen, caught in a moment that felt both innocent and dangerous all at once. Then, as quickly as it started, the moment passed. He turned to grab a glass from the cabinet, breaking our eye contact, and the spell was broken. I let out a quiet breath, trying to steady myself. This was silly. There was nothing to it, just a harmless look, a passing moment. But as he left the kitchen, I couldn't help but feel that something had shifted, something I wasn't quite ready to admit, even to myself. The next few times Ryan came over, I couldn't help but feel that tension hanging in the air, invisible but unmistakable. I tried my best to ignore it, telling myself that I was being ridiculous, that I was reading too much into things, but it was hard to ignore the way his gaze followed me when he thought I wasn't looking, or the way his smile lingered a little too long. One evening, my son had invited a group of friends over to watch a game, and as usual, Ryan was among them. I had planned to stay out of the way, but as the night wore on, I found myself drifting toward the living room, curious about the laughter and the noise spilling out into the hallway. I peeked in, and there was Ryan sitting on the couch, his eyes catching mine across the room. The others were too engrossed in the game to notice, but Ryan's attention was fixed on me. He gave me a small, almost mischievous smile, and I felt a thrill that I couldn't explain. My face flushed, and I quickly looked away, but I couldn't deny the rush I felt. It was like being pulled into a current, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to fight it. When the game ended and most of the boys had left, Ryan stayed behind to help clean up, as he often did. It was just the two of us in the kitchen, and the silence was heavy, filled with all the things we weren't saying. I felt his presence beside me, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his arm against mine, and my pulse quickened. It was so easy to forget the age gap, the roles we played. In that moment, he wasn't just my son's friend. He was someone who looked at me in a way that made me feel seen, wanted. "Thanks for helping, Ryan," I said, my voice coming out quieter than I intended. He glanced at me, and I could see the same mix of emotions in his eyes that I was feeling. Curiosity, confusion, maybe even a hint of longing. "Anytime, Mrs. Carson," he replied, his voice soft. "You know I like being here." The words hung in the air, and I felt the pull between us again, stronger this time, harder to ignore. I wanted to say something to break the tension, to bring us back to the safety of small talk, but the words wouldn't come. My heart was racing, my breath catching in my throat, and all I could do was stand there, caught in the moment. Without thinking, I reached out, my hand brushing against his arm. It was a small gesture, innocent enough, but the electricity that shot through me was anything but innocent. He looked down at my hand, then back at me, and I saw the question in his eyes. He didn't move, didn't say anything, just waited, as if he was leaving the decision up to me. I knew I should pull away, that I should laugh it off and put an end to whatever this was. But I couldn't. I didn't want to. There was a part of me, a part I didn't recognize, that wanted to see where this would lead, that was drawn to the thrill of stepping over the line. But just as quickly as the thought came, I pushed it away, pulling my hand back and forcing a smile. "Well, I guess I should finish cleaning up," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He nodded, his eyes still on me, as if he knew what I was feeling, even if I couldn't admit it myself. As he left, I felt a pang of regret, a sense of something unfinished, hanging in the air. I knew this couldn't happen, that it shouldn't happen, but that didn't stop me from wondering what it would feel like if I hadn't pulled away. The days that followed were filled with an uneasy silence, as if a fragile balance had been disrupted, and neither of us knew how to set it right again. I'd catch myself glancing at my phone, wondering if Ryan would text, or if he was thinking about that moment in the kitchen as much as I was. But he didn't, and neither did I. We just went about our lives, pretending that nothing had changed. Then, one evening, my son had a late practice and wouldn't be home until much later. I was in the middle of preparing dinner when there was a knock at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone, so when I opened it and saw Ryan standing there, I felt my stomach flip. "Hey, Mrs. Carson," he said, looking a bit nervous. "I thought I'd swing by and see if you needed help with anything. I didn't have any plans tonight." It felt innocent enough, but there was something in his eyes that suggested he was just as unsure as I was. I should have turned him away, made some excuse, but instead I found myself stepping aside, letting him in. We ended up in the kitchen, just like before, talking as I chopped vegetables and stirred pots. At first, the conversation was light, safe, revolving around harmless topics like school and his plans for the summer. But as the evening went on, it started to feel like we were both dancing around something, avoiding the question neither of us wanted to ask. At one point, I reached for a bowl, and our hands brushed. It was such a small thing, but I felt a jolt, and when I looked up, I saw that he'd felt it too. We stood there, inches apart, and the air between us seemed to thicken, pulling us together like a magnet. I could see the conflict in his eyes, the same hesitation and curiosity that had been brewing in me. "Ryan?" I began, my voice barely above a whisper. I wanted to say something, to explain away whatever it was that had come between us, but I couldn't find the words. All I knew was that in that moment, he wasn't just my son's friend. He was someone who saw me, who made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. He didn't move, didn't pull away, and neither did I. We just stood there, caught in a moment that felt both impossible and inevitable. I could feel my heart pounding, and I knew that I was standing at a crossroads, that I could either step forward or walk away. But before I could make a choice, he spoke, his voice soft and filled with something I couldn't quite place. "I should go," he said, his gaze steady, but I could see the sadness in his eyes. "I don't want to mess things up." He turned and walked toward the door, and as he reached for the handle, I felt a pang of something I couldn't explain, a mix of relief and disappointment, knowing that he was doing what was right, even if it hurt. "Ryan!" I called after him, my voice shaky. He stopped looking back at me, and for a moment I thought about telling him to stay, about letting whatever this was unfold, but I couldn't bring myself to say the words. Instead, I just managed a faint smile, the kind you give someone when you're saying goodbye to something you can't have. "Take care of yourself," I said quietly, and he nodded, giving me one last look before he walked out the door. As the door closed behind him, I stood there in the silence, feeling the weight of everything that had almost happened, and everything that never would. It was over before it began, a moment suspended in time, and as much as it hurt, I knew it was for the best. Some things are meant to stay as an almost, memories that linger but never take root. And as I turned back to the empty kitchen, I couldn't help but feel grateful for the reminder of what it meant to feel alive, even if it was just for a moment. Click on the subscribe button on the screen and check out our channel for more videos like this.